You've made a mistake. Deliveries are always sent to the kitchen entrance. You're at the wrong door.
The voice was ice, sharp as a shard of broken glass. It belonged to Eleanor Davenport, the 70-year-old matriarch of the family, standing rigid in her marble foyer. The pearls at her throat seemed to radiate the same coldness. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. She was judging. Only seconds before, the doorbell had rung, tearing through the suffocating atmosphere of the Thanksgiving gathering. Inside, the Beacon Hill mansion smelled of polished mahogany and roasting spices, but it was as cold as a tomb. Richard Davenport, the billionaire CEO, had frozen. His hand, deep in his trouser pocket, was twisting a brass button. It was his nervous tick. It was his lifelong fear of his mother. Sophia, the new wife, trying desperately to please her terrifying mother-in-law, had also jumped. She was in the dining room, failing to arrange the heavy heirloom silver, an impossible task. "The forks are a quarter-inch out of alignment, Sophia," Eleanor had hissed just moments earlier. "Tradition demands perfection." But when the bell rang, Richard, moving like a man in a trance, had drifted to the heavy oak door. He pulled it open, and his world collapsed. Amara Evans stood there, the black woman he had once loved, the woman his mother had exiled 10 years ago, calling her a mistake. She wore an elegant camel coat, her posture poised, her eyes silent. Clutched in her hand was the hand of a 10-year-old girl, a little girl with her mother's watchful, intelligent eyes, and Richard's exact chin. Richard couldn't breathe. It was then that Eleanor swept in, annoyed by the draft. She didn't look at her son. She saw only an inconvenience at her front door. She didn't see a person. She saw a violation of her rules. It was that deep-seated prejudice, the old money disdain for anyone who didn't belong, that made her speak. She didn't even ask who they were. She had already decided. Voiceover. Eleanor Davenport had just made a $500 million mistake. She thought she was speaking to a delivery person, but she had no idea she was insulting her family's anonymous donor, the woman who held the Davenport legacy in the palm of her hand. Amara Evans didn't flinch. She didn't gasp or stammer or defend herself against the insult. Her stillness was its own form of power. She met Eleanor's icy gaze with a calm that was more unnerving than any outburst. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, her voice even. "I'm not making a delivery." She then turned her eyes to the man still frozen in the doorway, the man who looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Richard." The little girl, Eliza, clutched her mother's hand, her wide, intelligent eyes taking in the cavernous, cold house. She was not scared, she was processing. Sophia, the new wife, had drifted into the foyer, holding a silver gravy boat, curious about the commotion. She was still reeling from Eleanor's earlier critique about the tradition of the silverware. She saw the scene: the elegant Anne Famler black woman, the little girl, and her husband's face pale as death. She saw his hand in his pocket, twisting, twisting. Sophia instantly knew this was no stranger. "Richard!" Eleanor demanded, her eyes narrowing, realizing this wasn't a simple mistake. "What is the meaning of this? Tell this person to state her business." Richard's mouth opened, but only a choked whisper came out. "Amara." He couldn't form the words. He was the same coward he had been 10 years ago. Amara, seeing he was incapable, spoke for him. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cold air, clear and precise, aimed at Richard. "This is Eliza," she said. "She wanted to meet her father." The silver gravy boat slipped from Sophia's numb fingers. It hit the marble floor with a deafening, echoing clang. The sound was violent in the oppressive silence, a punctuation mark on the secret that had just been detonated. Sophia stared, her face draining of all color as she whispered the one word that confirmed her terror. "Father?" Eleanor Davenport's face became a mask of aristocratic fury. The sound of the dropped silver, the word father, it was all a disaster. She physically stepped in front of her paralyzed son, shielding him as if Amara were an attacker. "This is absurd," Eleanor declared, her voice regaining its steel. Richard, tell this woman to leave our home. This instant. Richard looked at Amara, his eyes filled with a decade of shame. She is not leaving, he managed to say. The words were a pale, weak echo of the man he should have been 10 years ago. He remembered the last time he defended her, the shouting match in his dorm room, his mother's ultimatum, her or this family, and the deafening, cowardly silence that followed as he chose his inheritance. Eleanor, seeing his weakness, took full control. Very well. Her voice was dangerously smooth. Let's hear the story. She turned, her back rigid, and gestured not toward the warm den, but toward the formal living room, a cold, unlit, museum-like space. We will discuss this in here. As they walked, Sophia, still shaking, finally confronted her husband. Richard, who is this woman? What does she mean, father? Before Richard could find his voice, Eleanor interrupted, her words slicing through the air. She is no one, Sophia, a failed artist from his college days, a youthful mistake. Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, pointedly refusing to look at Eliza. She is obviously here for money. It's always money with people of her background. Amara's voice cut through the tension, calm and sharp. Eliza is 10 years old, Richard. I left messages. I sent letters. Your secretary always said you were unavailable. She looked directly at Eleanor. I see now your mother was simply more efficient than I realized. While the adults stood frozen in that tense, bitter silence, the 10-year-old girl, Eliza, finally let go of her mother's hand. She was bored by the anger and the whispering. Her eyes, bright and curious, scanned the cold, museum-like room, passing over the stiff, high-backed chairs and the unlit fireplace. They landed on the massive abstract painting that dominated the wall, a swirl of dark, brooding reds and blacks. While Eleanor was still fuming over Amara's accusation, Eliza wandered closer to the canvas. She tilted her head, her expression serious. Her young, clear voice echoed in the stiff, opulent room. Mom? That's not a real Rothko, is it? Amara's head snapped toward her. Eliza, stay with me. But the girl was lost in concentration. But look, she said, pointing. The color bleed is all wrong, and the signature is too thick. You taught me. Eleanor, who had been momentarily silenced by Amara, now had a new target for her fury. She let out a short, ugly scoff. What did you say, child? Her disdain, which had been focused on Amara, now transferred to her daughter. Eliza, unafraid, repeated, I said it's a fake. Eleanor's face, pale with anger, began to turn a dangerous shade of purple. That painting was her prized acquisition, a symbol of her superior taste and the Davenport's cultural standing. How dare you, Eleanor hissed, her voice trembling. How dare you bring this insolent child into my home to question my taste? Amara moved to her daughter's side, placing a calm hand on her shoulder. That's enough art critique, sweetheart. She then looked at Eleanor, her voice cool and steady. She's just observant. It's a skill we value. Sophia, watching from the doorway, felt a strange jolt. Eleanor had just dismissed Amara as a failed artist. Yet that failed artist had clearly taught her 10-year-old daughter more about art than this entire family, obsessed with their legacy, would ever know. Eleanor Davenport was visibly trembling, furious at being challenged by a child. She pivoted back to the one weapon she knew how to wield, financial intimidation. She ignored the painting and fixed her venomous gaze on Amara. You value skills, she sneered. How amusing. Let's talk about value. State your price. How much will it take to make you leave this house and never return? 20,000? 30,000? Richard, who had been standing silent, his hand twisting the button in his pocket, finally let out a choked sound. Mother, stop, he whispered, his voice cracking. This is my daughter. Eleanor wheeled on him, her eyes flashing. It is a problem, Richard, one I am trying to solve. We are on the verge of the most important moment in this family's history, our tradition. She was performing now, turning her body slightly towards Sophia, but projecting her voice at Amara, as if lecturing a peasant. Sophia, you may not understand this, but the Davenport Foundation is our legacy. It represents generations of our family's contribution to the city. We are currently finalizing the new wing. She paused, her thin smile returning, full of arrogance. We are just waiting on a significant endowment, a $500 million donation. Richard looked horrified. Mother, that is confidential board business. Eleanor waved him off. Why? I want Ms. Evans to understand what real legacy looks like, what real money is. She looked Amara up and down, her eyes lingering on the simple camel coat. Not this pathetic, grubby attempt to get a handout. Amara, who had been looking at the unlit fireplace, slowly turned her head. Her expression had changed. The sadness and nostalgia that had been in her eyes when she first saw Richard were gone. They were now replaced by a cold, hard focus. The mention of the $500 million donation, combined with Eleanor's cruel insults, had visibly clicked something into place. She finally understood the full scope of the arrogance she was facing. A handout, Eleanor? Amara asked, her voice quiet, yet it seemed to cut through the heavy, perfumed air of the room. Is that what you called it 10 years ago? What was my price then? $50,000 and a threat to destroy Richard's career if I didn't disappear? Richard flinched as if struck. Amara, please, don't. He looked desperately between his mother and the woman he had wronged, still twisting the button in his pocket, a man-child trapped in a billionaire suit. Amara ignored him, her eyes locked on Eleanor. You bought his silence, she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. You bought his weakness, and you've been paying for it ever since. Her gaze swept across the cold, opulent room, noting the stiff furniture and the priceless, yet fake, painting. This house, it's not a home. It's a mausoleum. And that painting, she gestured to the Rothko, is fake, just like your legacy. This was too much for Eleanor. The insult to her home, her taste, and her family's name, all from this woman she had dismissed as nothing, was an unforgivable offense. She was trembling with a pure, unadulterated rage. She wanted to destroy this woman who dared to see the truth. Eleanor Davenport stepped toward Amara, her face a mask of aristocratic fury. You should have known your place then, and you should know your place now. Get out of my house. Amara didn't move. She didn't flinch or retreat or even breathe heavily. She just stood there, her gaze steady, holding her daughter's hand. This stillness, this refusal to be intimidated, was the final insult. It infuriated Eleanor more than any argument could have. Did you hear me? Eleanor's voice rose, the polite, cold veneer cracking to reveal the raw hate beneath. I said, get out. You think you can waltz in here with your... She sneered at Eliza. Bastard child. Mother! Richard's voice finally exploded, a sharp crack of shame and terror. Eleanor wheeled on him, her eyes blazing. Don't you mother me, Richard. This is your weakness. This is what happens when you associate with their kind. She spat the words out, the venom intended for the entire room to feel. You let this gold digger into your life, and now she's back, trying to ruin the most important deal of our lives. Sophia, who had been watching in silent horror, finally spoke, her voice a terrified whisper. Eleanor, stop, please. Eleanor ignored her. Her entire focus was on Amara, a predator cornering its prey. You want money, is that it? She jabbed a finger, her pearls quivering. You think you're better than us? You with your cheap code and your observant child? She looked Amara up and down with pure, unadulterated contempt. You are nothing. You come from nothing, and you will always be nothing. This was the speech, the absolute height of arrogance and hate. The air in the room was toxic, unbreathable. Richard was frozen in shame, his face ashen. Sophia looked physically ill, as if she had just seen the true, monstrous face of the family she had married into. And Amara just watched and waited. Amara waited. She let the silence stretch, letting Eleanor's vile words hang in the air, echoing in the cold, opulent room. She waited until Eleanor's breathing was heavy and ragged, until the old woman's fury had completely spent itself. The only sound was the heavy tick-tock of the grandfather clock, measuring the seconds of Eleanor's spectacular downfall. Then Amara nodded slowly, as if a final, quiet decision had just been made. "You're right, Eleanor," Amara said. Her voice was quiet, but it sliced through the room, suddenly filling it with an authority that dwarfed Eleanor's. "We should talk about knowing our place, and we should talk about your $500 million donation." Eleanor scoffed, a desperate, dismissive sound as she tried to regain her footing. "What in the world would you know about a $500 million donation?" "I know," Amara said, her voice clear and precise, "that for the last 6 months, the Davenport Foundation has been desperately and unsuccessfully courting an anonymous donor for your new expansion, a donor who pledged $500 million to save your legacy." Eleanor's sneer faltered. Her hand, which had been jabbing the air, went instinctively to her pearls, clutching them. That is confidential board business. How could you?" "It was confidential," Amara corrected her. "I am Amara Evans." Shuriruin, she paused, letting her name, the name Eleanor had dismissed as nothing, land. "I am the founder and chair of the AE Foundation." She let that sink in for a moment. Richard, who had been staring at the floor in shame, slowly lifted his head. His eyes widened, not just with shock, but with a sudden dawning comprehension. A.E. Amara Evans. Amara looked directly at Eleanor, her gaze unwavering. "And I am your anonymous donor." Or rather, she added, as the last vestiges of color drained from Eleanor's face, "I was." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier and more final than the snow falling outside the leaded glass windows. It was the sound of an entire dynasty grinding to a halt. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, but this time not with fear. It was with a sudden, dawning, stunned awe. She was looking at Amara as if seeing her for the first time. Richard looked as if he had been physically struck, as if the wind had been knocked out of him. He stared at Amara, finally understanding the chasm that had opened between them in 10 years. Not a chasm of failure, but of her staggering success. And Eleanor stumbled back, her hand clutching her pearls as if they were a life raft and she was on a sinking ship. She collapsed into a high-backed, brocaded chair. Her face, which had been purple with rage, was now a ghastly ashen white. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "No, it can't be. That's a lie." "I came here today, Richard," Amara said, her voice soft now, speaking to him as if they were the only two in the room, "to see if you had finally become a man, to see if my daughter's father was someone worth knowing." Her gaze hardened as she turned back to the woman in the chair. "I came to see if the Davenport legacy was one worth investing in." Eleanor just shook her head, speechless. "You just gave me my answer," Amara said. She looked around the opulent, cold room, her gaze finally resting on the defeated matriarch. "The donation is officially revoked, effective immediately. You and your tradition are bankrupt." As if summoned by her words, the acrid, bitter smell of the overcooked turkey, the smell of a ruined feast wafted in from the kitchen, filling the room with the scent of their failure. Eleanor Davenport, for the first time in her life, was completely, utterly silent. Sophia, the new wife, stood up. Her voice was shaking but clear. "Eleanor, you are a hateful, racist woman. And Richard," she turned to her husband, her eyes filled with contempt, "you are a coward." Sophia stood in the middle of the room, her voice shaking but clear, having just delivered her devastating verdict. She had called Eleanor a hateful, racist woman, and her husband, Richard, a coward. Now she acted. Her movements were deliberate. She walked not toward her husband, but to the antique mahogany coffee table, the one sitting in front of the cold, unlit fireplace. She looked down at her hand, the one wearing the large new diamond wedding ring. "When I married you, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but caring in the dead silence, "I thought I was marrying into a legacy. I thought tradition meant something noble." She shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her. "I didn't realize that legacy was built on cruelty and hate." She glanced at Amara, her eyes filled not with jealousy, but with a grim, horrified respect. "Your mother," she said to Richard, "called her a gold digger, but the only one desperate to join this tradition was me, and I'm not willing to be paid this price." With a final, steady hand, She pulled the heavy diamond ring from her finger. She placed it on the antique table next to a silver candy dish. The quiet, final click of the diamond hitting the polished wood echoed louder than any shout. It was the sound of a contract breaking. "I will not spend my life," Sophia said, her voice now firm, "in a house built on lies." Sophia didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply turned and walked with a newfound dignity to the grand foyer. Her footsteps were steady on the cold marble, each one a hammer blow to Richard's hollow world. He made a weak, stumbling movement to follow, his hand outstretched. "Sophia, wait!" he pleaded. "It's Thanksgiving. It's snowing. Where will you go?" Sophia's hand was on the heavy, ornate doorknob. She paused, but she did not look back. "Anywhere," she said, her voice muffled but final. "But here." The heavy oak door opened, letting in a swirl of snow and the clean, cold air of the city. Then it slammed shut. The sound was absolute, echoing through the entire mansion, sealing the end of Richard's second marriage. He was left standing alone in the massive foyer, a man completely and utterly trapped. He looked into the living room. On one side, his mother, Eleanor, was still slumped in her chair, a catatonic, ashen figure who had just lost $500 million in all her power. On the other side, standing by the doorway, was his former love, Amara, holding the hand of the daughter he never knew. The suffocating, acrid smell of the burnt turkey was everywhere now, the undeniable scent of a ruined feast. Richard Davenport, the billionaire CEO, had his legacy, and it was empty. Richard stood paralyzed in the foyer, the sound of the slamming door echoing in his ears. He was completely numb. Slowly, as if moving underwater, he turned. He finally turned his full attention to Amara. She and Eliza were standing near the living room entrance, watching him, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary sadness. His eyes met Amara's, and the weight of a decade of regret, cowardice, and shame crashed down on him. "Amara," he whispered, his voice broken. I'm sorry." Amara looked at him, her gaze piercing. "Sorry for what, Richard?" she asked, her voice soft, but it cut deeper than any shout. "For then or for now? Are you sorry I lost you? Or are you sorry you just lost 500 million? "No," he choked out, shaking his head. For everything. For what Eliza had to see." Amara's expression softened into something close to pity. "Don't be sorry she saw it, Richard," she said gently. "Be sorry you caused it. Today my daughter saw what happens when people value bloodlines over character. She saw a woman stand up to a bully." Amara paused, her eyes glancing at the shell-shocked man before her. "And she saw what a man looks like when he has no courage at all." "Shucky," Richard flinched, the quiet truth of her words hitting him with more force than Eleanor's rage or Sophia's departure. He had no defense. He had caused all of this. He looked at Amara, then at his silent, defeated mother slumped in the chair. He looked back at Amara, the woman he had abandoned. A dam of resentment, built not over 10 years but over his entire 40-year life, finally began to break. "You," he whispered, his voice trembling with a new, unfamiliar rage. A rage directed not at Amara, but at its true source. This was all you. Richard, shaking, his voice trembling with a new, unfamiliar rage, took a step toward the living room. He was no longer looking at Amara. His entire focus was fixed on the slumped figure in the chair. "You," he whispered again. "This was all you." Eleanor looked up, her eyes still glazed with the shock of losing $500 million. But a flicker of the old steel, the old entitlement, returned. "Richard," she rasped, her voice a dry command. "That money, you must fix this. Grovel. Apologize to her. Do whatever you have to do, but you will get that money back." It was the wrong thing to say. It was the last link in a chain of control that had defined his entire life. "Grovel?" Richard stopped. He looked at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. His voice was dangerously quiet. "You're still talking about the money?" "It's the legacy, Richard," she hissed. "The Davenport name. Our tradition." "Tradition?" He let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Tradition? He looked around the cold, silent room, his eyes landing on a priceless 18th century porcelain vase on the mantel, a symbol of the legacy he was supposed to protect. With a sudden, violent movement, he swept his arm across the mantel. The vase shattered on the marble hearth, exploding into 1,000 pieces. Eliza jumped. Amara pulled her daughter close, placing a protective hand on her shoulder, but her eyes never left Richard. "This is the legacy," Richard roared, his voice echoing through the mansion, a primal scream decades in the making. "This empty, broken, fake room, this house, this hate!" Eleanor gasped, genuinely shocked, shrinking back from her own son. "Richard, how dare you?" "No!" he shouted, jabbing a finger at her, the finger no longer trembling, but rigid with rage. "How dare you? You took her from me. 10 years ago, you told me she wasn't our kind. You paid her to leave. You threatened me. And like a fool, like a child, I let you." He reached into his pocket, his hand closing around the brass button he had been twisting all day. He pulled it out, this symbol of his fear, this relic of his grandfather's oppressive tradition. He stared at it for a second, then with a final gesture of defiance, he threw the brass button into the unlit fireplace. It clattered uselessly against the cold iron. "I am done," he panted, his chest heaving. "I am done with your traditions." He turned away from his ruined mother, his rebellion complete. The rage evaporated, leaving him empty and exposed. He faced Amara. He was crying now, not silent, respectable tears, but the open, ugly sobs of a man who had just broken his entire life apart. He didn't try to touch her. He didn't dare. He just stood there, his expensive suit rumpled, his face wet, utterly ashamed. "She's right," he choked out, the words tasting like poison. "Amara, you were right. I am a coward. I've been a coward my whole life." He glanced back at Eleanor, who was staring at the shattered vase with dead eyes. "I hid behind her money," he spat, "and I hid from my own heart." He turned back to Amara, his eyes pleading. "I don't care about the 500 million. I swear I don't." His voice cracked. "I don't care about this house. It's all blood money. It's all fake." He gestured helplessly around him. My wife just left me, and I deserve it. I deserve all of this." He took one hesitant step closer, but stopped, not wanting to frighten them. He looked at Eliza, who was watching him with wide, serious eyes from behind the safety of Amara's coat. "But she doesn't deserve this," he whispered, his voice breaking. "She doesn't deserve a coward for a father, and she damn sure doesn't deserve her." He nodded with contempt at Eleanor. "For a grandmother." He looked at Amara, his eyes stripped of all pride, all pretense. "Amara, I know I can't change what I was. I know that. But please don't let me be the reason my daughter grows up thinking this." He waved at the cold room, the broken porcelain, the silent, hateful woman in the chair. "Thinking this hate is what a family is. Please, I'm begging you. Don't let her win. Don't let her poison my child too." Amara was silent for a long, heavy moment. The only sounds in the room were Richard's ragged breathing and the relentless tick-tock of the clock. She looked at the shattered porcelain on the floor, a symbol of a legacy that had just imploded. She looked at the defeated matriarch, Eleanor, who for the first time in her life looked old, small, and utterly irrelevant. Then her gaze returned to Richard. He was no longer a CEO, no longer a Davenport heir. He was just a man, stripped bare, waiting for a verdict. And then a small voice broke the silence. Eliza, who had been watching her father's breakdown with wide, serious eyes, stepped out from behind Amara's coat. She looked at the weeping man. She didn't look scared anymore. She just looked curious. "Mom," she asked, her voice quiet but clear, Is he going to be okay?" Amara's breath caught. She looked down at her daughter. That simple, empathetic question, that instinctive kindness toward the very man who had caused all this pain was the answer. Eliza was not like them. She was not a Davenport. She was hers, and she was kind. In that instant, Amara made her decision. She took a deep breath, her posture shifting from weary defense to quiet resolution. She knelt and zipped up Eliza's coat. "Get your coat, Richard," she said. Richard looked up, his face stained with tears, his expression one of pure confusion. "What?" Amara stood, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "You heard me. We're leaving. You too." Richard was stunned, immobile. Where are we going?" From her chair, Eleanor's voice, a dry, papery rustle, tried one last time to assert control. "Richard," she whispered, "don't you dare leave me." Richard looked at his mother, his eyes now flat, no longer angry, just empty. He had thrown away the button. The fear was gone. "Goodbye, Mother," he said simply. He turned and walked to the hall closet, pulling out not his expensive CEO overcoat, but a simple worn jacket he hadn't worn in years. He zipped it up, his hands fumbling, and followed Amara and Eliza to the heavy front door. Amara stopped at the threshold, her hand on the doorknob. She looked back one last time at the woman in the chair. "The donation is gone, Eleanor," she said, her voice clear and final. "That is justice. My daughter will never set foot in this house again. That is a promise." She then turned to Richard, who was standing there, looking lost. "But what happens next," she said, her voice softening slightly, "is not about her. It's about him." She paused, realizing her old habit, and corrected herself, placing a hand on Eliza's head. "It's about her. I'm not doing this for you, Richard. I'm doing this for our daughter. She deserves to know that her father at least tried." With that, she turned the heavy brass knob. She pulled the heavy oak door open, and the cold, clean night air rushed in, clearing out the suffocating, toxic smell of burnt turkey and hate. Amara and Eliza stepped out onto the wide stone steps, into the falling snow. The city lights cast a soft glow on the fresh, white blanket. Richard hesitated at the threshold, a man caught between two worlds. He looked back, just once, into the grand, dark foyer. He saw the cold marble, the staircase leading up to empty rooms, and the archway to the living room where his mother sat, a shrunken, defeated figure in a house that had become her prison. It was the tomb of his childhood. He then looked forward at Amara and Eliza. Their silhouettes were dark against the white snow, waiting. He stepped out of the house. He stepped into the cold, clean air. He zipped his jacket to his chin. The sound of the zipper was loud in the sudden quiet. What now?" His voice was raw, uncertain. Amara looked at him, the snow dusting her hair. "Now," she said, "we go to my hotel, and on the way you can tell your daughter about your grandfather's brass button, and why you finally threw it away." Richard's head snapped up. He was stunned. He didn't even know she'd noticed his nervous habit from 10 years ago, let alone today. "And then tomorrow," Amara continued, her voice firm but not unkind, "you can take her to get breakfast, and you can start being a father." She took a small step toward him, her gaze intense. "A father is more than DNA, Richard. It's courage. It's showing up." She offered a small, sad smile, the first one he had seen all night. "You're 10 years late, but you showed up." Amara and Eliza turned and began to walk down the snow-covered path. Richard, for the first time in his life, followed. He was no longer a CEO, no longer a billionaire heir. He was just a man, walking in the snow, his hands in his empty pockets, trying to catch up to his family. Behind them, the grand Davenport mansion stood dark, its opulent windows like empty, staring eyes. The ruined feast was left behind in the cold, silent rooms. Voiceover. Eleanor Davenport was left with her legacy, and it was empty. She had valued tradition over character, and in the end, she lost both. Richard, on the other hand, lost his fortune, his inheritance, and his wife, but he gained a daughter. Voiceover. The story of the Davenport family reminds us that true power isn't about how much money you have or what family you come from. It's about courage. The courage to stand up to hate, and the courage to forgive. Because justice, the voiceover concluded, as the three figures disappeared into the snowy night, can fix the past, But it is only forgiveness, long vita, that can build a future. The shattered Thanksgiving at the Davenport mansion reminds us that a true legacy is never found in polished heirloom silver or an arrogant family name. It is built from the quiet courage to stand against hatred and the strength to rebuild from the ashes of regret. This story shows that justice can often be delivered by the very people the world dismisses as weak, while discrimination, in the end, is left cold, empty, and alone. It is only respect and the grace of forgiveness that holds the true, lasting value needed to heal our past and build a future.